Officer Thomas Mitchell walked slowly down Maple Street on that warm Tuesday afternoon. The sun was shining bright, and the expensive houses looked peaceful with their perfect green lawns and fancy cars in the driveways. Thomas had been a police officer for 15 long years. He thought he knew everything about his neighborhood and the people who belonged there. As Thomas turned the corner, he noticed a well-dressed black man walking calmly along the sidewalk. The man wore a nice suit and carried himself with confidence. But something inside Thomas's mind started working the wrong way. He had watched too many crime shows on television. He had heard too many stories from other officers about suspicious people in good neighborhoods. Thomas felt his heart beat faster. His hands became sweaty. Without really thinking about what he was doing, he walked quickly toward the man. His voice came out rough and angry when he spoke. "Hey, you there?" Thomas called out loudly. "What are you doing here?" The man stopped walking and turned around slowly. His name was David Thompson. Though Thomas did not know this yet, David looked at Thomas with calm, steady eyes. He did not seem scared or angry, just patient. "I'm just walking, officer," David said in a quiet, respectful voice. "Is there a problem?" Thomas felt something ugly growing inside his chest. All the wrong ideas he had learned over the years came rushing into his mind. He looked at David's nice clothes and thought they must be stolen. He looked at the expensive houses round them and decided David did not belong there. "Don't lie to me," Thomas said, stepping closer. "People like you don't just walk round here for no reason." David remained perfectly still. He kept his hands where Thomas could see them. He did not raise his voice or make any sudden movements, but Thomas could see something sad appear in David's eyes. "I have every right to walk on this street, officer," David said gently. "I'm not doing anything wrong." But Thomas was not listening anymore. The prejudice in his heart had taken control. All the fear and wrong thinking he had carried for years came pouring out. Without warning, Thomas did something terrible and shameful. He spat on the ground near David's feet. "Go back where you belong," Thomas said with hatred in his voice. "We don't need your kind causing trouble in this neighborhood." David looked down at the spit on the ground, then back up at Thomas. The pain in his eyes was clear, but he did not lose his dignity. He did not shout back or curse or make threats. Instead, he stood up straighter and looked directly into Thomas's eyes. "I understand," David said quietly, his voice full of sadness but also wisdom. "I hope someday you will too." Thomas watched as David turned round and walked away slowly. David's shoulders were straight, and he moved with the same calm confidence as before. But Thomas could see that his words had hurt this good man deeply. As David disappeared round the corner, Thomas felt proud of himself. He thought he had done his job well. He believed he had protected the neighborhood from someone who did not belong. Thomas had no idea that he had just made the biggest mistake of his entire career. What Thomas did not know was that David Thompson was not just any man walking down the street. David was actually the newly appointed police chief for Thomas's department. David had spent years working his way up through police departments in other cities. He had earned respect everywhere he worked. He was known for being fair, honest, and dedicated to serving all people equally. David was supposed to start his new job as police chief the following Monday. He had been walking through the neighborhood to get familiar with the area he would be protecting. He wanted to understand the community better so he could be a good leader for his officers and a good protector for all the citizens. That evening, David went home to his small, simple apartment. He sat in his favorite chair and thought about what had happened with Thomas. This was not the first time someone had treated him badly because of his skin color. He had faced racism many times during his life and career. The experience still hurt, though, each time someone judged him unfairly. It felt like a small wound in his heart. But David had learned something important over the years. He had learned that anger and hatred only create more anger and hatred. He believed that people could change if given the right chance. David thought about his grandmother, who had raised him after his parents died. She always told him, "Son, when someone treats you badly, you have two choices. You can become bitter and hate them back, or you can stay kind and hope they learn to be better." As David sat in his quiet apartment, he made a decision. When he met Thomas again on Monday, he would not seek revenge. Instead, he would try to help Thomas become a better person and a better police officer. David believed in second chances because someone had once given him a second chance when he needed it most. Thomas went home that night feeling satisfied with his work, completely unaware that his whole world was about to change in just a few days. Monday morning arrived faster than Thomas Mitchell had expected. He woke up in his comfortable bed next to his wife Emma, feeling completely normal. The sun was streaming through their bedroom window, and he could hear his two children, Lucy and James, getting ready for school downstairs. Thomas put on his police uniform just like he had done every morning for the past 15 years. He looked at himself in the mirror and straightened his badge. He felt good about his work. He believed he was a good officer who protected his community well. The memory of Tuesday's encounter with the well-dressed black man had already faded from his mind. At breakfast, Emma poured him coffee and kissed his cheek. "Have a good day at work, honey," she said with a warm smile. "I heard you're getting a new boss today." "Yeah, some new police chief is starting," Thomas replied, eating his toast quickly. "Probably just another politician who doesn't understand real police work." Thomas arrived at the police station at exactly 8 o'clock. The building was buzzing with energy. All the officers were talking excitedly about meeting their new leader. Some were nervous, others were curious, and a few were skeptical about change. Officer Johnson walked up to Thomas with a big grin. "Hey Mitchell, are you ready to meet the new boss? I heard he came from the big city. Probably thinks he knows everything." Thomas laughed and shook his head. "They never last long anyway. These fancy chiefs come and go. We're the ones who really know how to do the job." Captain Williams, a stern man with gray hair, walked into the main room and called for attention. His voice echoed off the walls as he spoke loudly and clearly. "Ladies and gentlemen, quiet down please. Today is an important day for our department. We have a new police chief starting with us. I want everyone to give him your full respect and attention." The room became completely silent. About 30 officers stood in neat rows, all wearing their best uniforms. Thomas stood in the third row, feeling relaxed and confident. He wondered what kind of person their new boss would be. Captain Williams continued speaking. "This man has an excellent record. He has worked in 3 different cities and has always improved community relations. He believes in fair policing and treating all citizens with dignity." Thomas rolled his eyes slightly. He thought this sounded like typical political talk that meant nothing in real police work. "Ladies and gentlemen," Captain Williams announced proudly, "please welcome our new police chief, David Thompson." The door at the front of the room opened, and Thomas felt his entire world collapse round him. His heart stopped beating for what felt like a full minute. His mouth fell open, and his eyes grew wide with shock and terror. Walking into the room, wearing a perfectly pressed police uniform with shining badges and insignia, was the same black man Thomas had spat at and insulted. Just 6 days earlier, David Thompson looked exactly the same, but now He wore the uniform of the highest-ranking officer in their department. Thomas felt like he might faint. His face turned completely white. As if all the blood had drained from his body, his hands began shaking uncontrollably, and sweat started forming on his forehead. He wanted to run away, to hide, to disappear completely from the earth. The room remained deadly silent. All the other officers sensed that something was very wrong. But they did not understand what was happening. They could see Thomas looked sick, but they had no idea why. David Thompson walked to the front of the room with the same calm confidence Thomas remembered from Tuesday. David's eyes swept across all the officers, and for just a moment, his gaze stopped on Thomas. Their eyes met, and Thomas saw recognition there, but also something else. Not anger, not hatred, but something Thomas could not quite understand. David began speaking to the entire room in a strong, clear voice. "Good morning, everyone. I am deeply honored to lead this department and to work alongside such dedicated officers." Thomas could barely hear the words over the sound of his own heart pounding in his ears. He felt dizzy and sick to his stomach. "I believe strongly in community policing," David continued. "I believe in building bridges between the police and the people we serve. Most importantly, I believe in treating every single person with respect and dignity, no matter who they are, what they look like, or where they come from." Those last words hit Thomas like a punch to the stomach. He knew David was speaking directly to him, reminding him of his terrible behavior. Thomas's mind raced with panicked thoughts. Would David fire him immediately? Would he tell everyone what Thomas had done? How would Thomas explain to Emma and the children that he had lost his job because of his own stupidity and prejudice? The meeting continued for another 20 minutes, but Thomas heard nothing else. He stood frozen in place, watching his new boss and wondering if his career was over. After David finished speaking, the officers began to disperse. Several of them approached Thomas with concerned looks. "Mitchell, are you okay?" Officer Rodriguez asked quietly. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Thomas could not find words to answer. He watched as David Thompson walked toward the office that would now be his, carrying himself with dignity and authority. David paused at his office door and looked back at Thomas one more time. Then he disappeared inside, leaving Thomas to wonder what would happen next. Tuesday morning felt like the longest day of Thomas Mitchell's life, even though it had barely started. He arrived at the police station early, hoping to avoid seeing David Thompson. But as soon as he walked through the front door, the desk sergeant handed him a note. "Chief Thompson wants to see you in his office at 9 o'clock sharp," the sergeant said with a serious expression. Thomas felt his stomach drop. He spent the next hour walking round the station like a ghost, unable to focus on anything other. Officers tried to talk to him, but he could barely respond. His mind kept racing with terrible thoughts about what would happen to his family if he lost his job. At exactly 9 o'clock. Thomas stood outside David's office door. His legs felt so weak he worried they might not carry him inside. His hands were shaking, and sweat dripped down his back despite the cool morning air conditioning. He knocked softly on the door. "Come in," David's calm voice called from inside. Thomas opened the door and saw David sitting behind a large wooden desk. The office was neat and organized, with family photos on the desk and certificates hanging on the walls. David looked professional and in control, wearing his crisp uniform with all his badges perfectly placed. "Sit down, Thomas," David said in a voice that was neither angry nor friendly, just calm and steady. Thomas walked slowly to the chair across from David's desk. He sat down carefully, as if the chair might break underneath him. He could not bring himself to look directly at David. Instead, He stared down at his own hands, which were folded tightly in his lap. The silence in the room felt heavy and uncomfortable. Thomas could hear the clock on the wall ticking loudly. He could hear his own breathing and heartbeat. He waited for David to speak, knowing that whatever came next would change his life forever. "I could fire you today," David said finally, his voice still calm but serious. "What you did last Tuesday was completely wrong. It was hurtful, unprofessional, and against everything a police officer should represent." Thomas nodded his head quickly. "I know, sir. I'm so sorry. I was completely wrong. There's no excuse for what I did." David leaned forward slightly in his chair. "Look at me, Thomas." Thomas forced himself to raise his eyes and meet David's gaze. He expected to see anger or hatred there, but instead he saw something else. David's eyes were serious, but they also held something that looked almost like concern. "Tell me about yourself, Thomas," David said. "Do you have a family?" Thomas was surprised by the question. He had expected to be yelled at or immediately fired. "Yes, sir. I have a wife named Emma. We've been married for 12 years, and I have 2 children. Lucy is 8 years old, and James is 10. What do you love about them?" David asked. Thomas felt confused by these questions, but he answered honestly. "Emma is the kindest person I know. She volunteers at the children's school and takes care of everyone in our neighborhood. Lucy loves to draw pictures and wants to be an artist. James plays baseball and dreams of being a professional player someday." "What would you tell them if you lost your job today?" David asked quietly. For the first time since entering the office, Thomas felt tears forming in his eyes. His voice became shaky when he spoke. "I don't know, sir. This job is all I know. I've been a police officer for 15 years. It's how I provide for my family. It's who I am." David was quiet for a long moment. He seemed to be thinking carefully about something important. Then he began to speak in a softer voice. "I want to tell you something about my life, Thomas. I grew up very poor in a small town. My father left our family when I was only 5 years old. My mother had to work 3 different jobs just to keep food on our table and pay the rent for our tiny apartment." Thomas listened carefully, surprised that David was sharing such personal information. "I faced people like you many times in my life, Thomas," David continued. "People who looked at my skin color and decided they knew everything about me. People who assumed I was dangerous or didn't belong in certain places. People who treated me badly before they even knew my name." Thomas felt ashamed as he listened to David's words. "When I was 12 years old," David said, "a police officer stopped me while I was walking home from school. He pushed me against a wall and searched me for no reason except that I was a black boy in what he thought was the wrong neighborhood. I was scared and humiliated. Just like you made me feel last Tuesday." David paused and looked directly into Thomas's eyes. "But I learned something very important over the years, Thomas. Hate only creates more hate. If I had chosen to hate all police officers because of that one bad experience, I never would have become one myself. I never would have had the chance to make things better." Thomas felt something changing inside his heart as he listened. "I want to give you a choice, Thomas," David said. "You can face immediate termination and lose everything you've worked for. Or you can choose to work hard to become a better person and a better police officer." "What do you mean, sir?" Thomas asked with hope in his voice. "Community service, training classes about treating people fairly. Working directly with local families to understand their lives and their struggles. It won't be easy, and it will take time. But if you're truly willing to change, I'm willing to help you do it." Thomas felt hope flowing through him for the first time in days. "I'll do it, sir. I want to change. I want to be better." The next 3 months changed Thomas Mitchell's life in ways he never expected. Every single day felt like a challenge, but also like a gift he did not deserve. David Thompson had given him a second chance, and Thomas was determined not to waste it. Every evening after finishing his regular police work, Thomas drove his old pickup truck to the community center on Oak Street. The building was old and needed paint, but it was always full of warmth and activity. This was where Thomas would spend the next few hours serving dinner to families who did not have enough food. On his first evening at the community center, Thomas felt completely out of place. He stood in the kitchen wearing an apron that was too small for him, holding a large spoon and looking round nervously. The other volunteers seemed to know exactly what they were doing. But Thomas had never served food to strangers before. Mrs. Johnson, an elderly black woman with kind eyes and grey hair, noticed Thomas standing alone looking worried and confused. "You look nervous, young man," she said in a gentle voice. Walking over to him with a warm smile, Thomas felt embarrassed. "I've never done anything like this before," he admitted quietly. "I don't really know what I'm supposed to do." Mrs. Johnson laughed softly, not in a mean way, but in a way that made Thomas feel more comfortable. "Well, there's a first time for everything in life. Here, help me carry these plates to the serving line." Thomas took a stack of plates from Mrs. Johnson and followed her to the front of the kitchen. As they walked, she explained how the dinner service worked and introduced him to the other volunteers. Everyone was friendly and welcoming, which surprised Thomas. Over the following weeks, Thomas began to meet the people who came to the community center for meals. These were not the dangerous criminals he had imagined in his mind for so many years. Instead, they were regular people facing difficult times in their lives. He met Robert, a construction worker who had lost his job when his company went out of business. Robert was a quiet man who always said please and thank you. He had 3 children and was looking for work every day, but construction jobs were hard to find. Thomas met Maria, a single mother who worked 2 jobs to support her children. She cleaned offices at night and worked at a grocery store during the day. She was always tired, but she never complained. She talked about her children with love and pride. Hoping they would have better opportunities than she had, Thomas also met elderly Mr. Adams, who had grown up in the same neighborhood. During the 1950s, Mr. Adams told fascinating stories about how the community had changed over the years. He had served in the military and worked as a teacher for 30 years before retiring. As Thomas listened to these stories week after week, something important began changing in his heart and mind. These people were not threats to his community. They were part of his community. They were neighbors, parents, grandparents, and workers just trying to live good lives despite facing hard times. At home, Emma began to notice that her husband was different. Thomas seemed more thoughtful and less angry than before. He spent time reading books instead of just watching television. He asked questions about their children's friends at school, especially friends from different backgrounds. One evening, while they were washing dishes together after dinner, Emma decided to ask Thomas about the changes she was seeing. "You seem different lately," she said carefully. Not sure if she should bring up the subject, Thomas dried a plate slowly while he thought about how to answer. "I think I'm learning things I should have known a long time ago," he said honestly. "What kind of things?" Emma asked with genuine curiosity. Thomas set down the plate and looked at his wife. "I'm learning that I had wrong ideas about people. I made judgments about folks based on how they looked instead of who they really were." Emma smiled at her husband. She had always known he was a good man, but she could see he was becoming an even better man. In addition to his work at the community center, Thomas began reading books about different cultures and histories. David had given him a list of recommended books, and Thomas read every single one carefully. He learned about experiences he had never considered before. Thomas also attended weekly training classes about understanding bias and prejudice. These classes were taught by Dr. Williams, a professor from the local college. At first, Thomas felt defensive during these classes, but gradually he began to understand how his own thinking had been shaped by wrong ideas. Most importantly, Thomas began having regular meetings with David Thompson every Friday afternoon. These conversations helped Thomas process what he was learning and thinking about. "How are you feeling about the program?" David asked during one of their weekly meetings in his office. Thomas thought carefully before answering. "It's hard, sir. I'm realizing how wrong I was about so many things. I had ideas in my head that weren't based on reality, but I'm grateful for the chance to learn and change." David smiled with genuine warmth. "Growth is never easy, Thomas. Change requires courage and hard work, but you're doing the work, and that's what matters most." Thomas felt something he had not experienced in years. He felt proud of himself, not for arresting someone or writing tickets, but for becoming a better human being. He was learning to see people as individuals rather than as members of groups he feared or misunderstood. The transformation was slow but steady, and Thomas could feel himself becoming the kind of man and officer he had always wanted to be. 6 months had passed since that terrible Tuesday when Thomas Mitchell had made the worst mistake of his career. Now, as he walked through the same neighborhood where everything had started, Thomas felt like a completely different person. The anger and fear that used to fill his heart had been replaced with understanding and compassion. David Thompson had promoted Thomas to a new position called Community Liaison Officer. This meant Thomas spent his days building bridges between the police department and the families who lived in their city. Instead of looking for trouble, Thomas looked for ways to help and connect with people. On a bright Thursday afternoon, Thomas was walking through the downtown area when he heard raised voices coming from around the corner. He quickly walked toward the sound and saw a scene that made his stomach turn. Officer Mark Stevens, a younger policeman with only 3 years of experience, was roughly handling a black teenager who looked to be about 15 years old. "What's in that bag, kid?" Mark demanded in an aggressive voice, grabbing the teenager's backpack. "You better not be carrying anything illegal." The teenager looked scared and confused. He was well dressed in a school uniform and carried textbooks, but Mark was treating him like a dangerous criminal. Thomas could see the fear in the young man's eyes, and it reminded him of the pain he had once caused David Thompson. Thomas quickly walked over to where Mark and the teenager were standing. "Hey, Mark," Thomas called out in a calm but firm voice. "Let me handle this situation." Mark looked surprised to see Thomas. "I've got this under control. Mitchell, this kid looks suspicious." Thomas gently moved between Mark and the teenager. He looked at the young man with kind eyes and spoke in a warm, friendly voice that was completely different from Mark's harsh tone. "Hi there," Thomas said with a genuine smile. "I'm Officer Thomas Mitchell. What's your name, son?" The teenager looked nervous but answered politely. "Jeremy Washington, sir." "Jeremy," Thomas repeated, making sure to use the boy's name to show respect. "That's a really good name. Are you having a good day today?" Jeremy relaxed slightly when he heard Thomas's kind tone. Yes, sir. I was just walking home from school. I go to Lincoln High School, and I stay late for a math tutoring on Thursdays." Thomas nodded with understanding. "Math tutoring sounds smart. Education is really important. Are you doing well in your classes? Yes, sir. I want to go to college and study engineering. Jeremy said, his confidence growing as he realized Thomas was treating him with respect. Thomas could see Mark standing nearby with a confused expression on his face. Mark clearly did not understand why Thomas was being so friendly to someone he had viewed as suspicious. That's wonderful. Jeremy, Thomas continued, engineering is a great field. You keep working hard in school, okay? Have a great rest of your day. Thank you, Officer Mitchell, Jeremy said with relief. You too, sir. Thomas watched as Jeremy walked away safely, his backpack full of school books bouncing as he headed toward his home. Only after Jeremy was completely out of sight did Thomas turned to address Mark. Mark looked completely puzzled. Thomas, why didn't you search him? He could have been carrying drugs or weapons. Thomas put his hand on Mark's shoulder in a friendly way. Mark, he was just a kid walking home from school with his math books. Not every person we encounter is a criminal. Our job is to protect and serve everyone in our community, including young people like Jeremy. Mark shook his head, still not understanding. But you can never be too careful. You're right that we need to be careful. Thomas agreed. But we also need to be fair and treat people with dignity. That young man was doing nothing wrong. He was being a good student and working hard for his future. That evening, Thomas received a call asking him to come to David Thompson's office. As Thomas walked down the familiar hallway, he remembered how terrified he had felt the last time David had called him in. This time, however, he felt calm and confident. David was sitting behind his desk with a big smile on his face when Thomas entered the office. Sit down, Thomas. I have some very good news to share with you. Thomas sat in the same chair where he had once feared for his job and his family's future. Now, he felt proud of the work he had been doing. Thomas, David began, I want to promote you to head our brand new community relations unit. You've shown incredible change and growth over these past months. You've become exactly the kind of officer our community needs. I'm very proud of you. Thomas felt emotions welling up in his chest. Thank you, sir. You saved my life and my family by giving me that second chance when I didn't deserve it. David shook his head with a warm smile. You saved yourself. Thomas, I just opened a door. You're the one who walked through it and did all the hard work to change. 1 year later, Thomas found himself standing in front of a classroom full of young police cadets at the academy. He was now responsible for teaching new officers about community relations and treating all people with dignity and respect. I want to tell you something important about my own journey, Thomas began, looking at the eager faces of the future officers. I used to be filled with fear and prejudice. I made terrible mistakes because I judged people by their appearance, instead of their character. The young cadets listened carefully as Thomas shared his story honestly. But I learned something that changed my entire life. Thomas continued, when we see each other as human beings first, everything changes. Every single person deserves respect, regardless of their background, their skin color, or their appearance. After his presentation, a young female cadet raised her hand. Officer Mitchell, how do we overcome our own biases and prejudices? Thomas smiled, remembering when he had asked David a similar question. Start by listening, really listening to people's stories with an open heart. You'll discover that we're all much more alike than different. We all want safety, respect, and opportunities for our families. That evening, Thomas drove home to his family feeling fulfilled and purposeful. During dinner with Emma, Lucy, and James, he told them about his day at the academy. Dad. His daughter Lucy asked with curiosity, Why do you spend so much time helping people now? Thomas looked at his beautiful daughter and thought carefully about his answer. Because someone gave me a second chance when I didn't deserve it, sweetheart. Now I want to help other people get their second chances too. Emma reached across the table and squeezed Thomas's hand. She was proud of the man her husband had become. The story of Thomas Mitchell and David Thompson spread throughout their city, and eventually to other communities. It became a powerful symbol that people can change, that forgiveness has incredible power, and that understanding can overcome even the deepest prejudices. Local newspapers wrote articles about their partnership. Other police departments invited them to speak about building better community relations. Schools asked them to talk to students about treating everyone with respect. But for Thomas, the most important reward was not the recognition or the promotion. It was the knowledge that he had become a better father, husband, and human being. He had learned to see the world through different eyes, and that had made all the difference. No matter how far people fall or how wrong they have been. It is never too late to change, to grow, and to become better versions of themselves. Sometimes the greatest transformations come from the most unexpected second chances, and sometimes the people who hurt us the most can become the people who help us grow the most. Thomas had learned that courage is not about being tough or aggressive. Real courage is about admitting when you are wrong, accepting help to change, and working every day to become a better person. It is about seeing the humanity in everyone you meet and treating them with the respect and dignity that all people deserve.